Here's everything I know about the Ford Modular 2-valve motor. In typical fashion, the 2-valve modular motor was introduced in the Lincoln lineup of Ford vehicles. It came out initially in the Lincoln Town Car in the 2-valve variety and the 4-valve variety in the Lincoln Mark 8. We're not talking about the 4-valve variety in this video though. Soon we'll have a video on the 4-valve lineup. The Ford Modular was available in 3 displacements and 2 layouts, the common 4.6 and the less common 5.4 liter V8, and then the V10 motor, the 6.8 liter. The V10 is identical to the 5.4 aside from the addition of 2 cylinders at the front of the motor. The 4.6 and the 5.4 have a performance improved and a non-performance improved variant. This performance improved motor was available from 2004 roughly and on from there. The NPI, the non-performance improved, was dropped entirely in 1999 for the Ford Mustang line and entirely in 2003 for the Crown Victoria, the Lincoln Town Car, and the Mercury Grand Marquis. 1999 to 2004 was a weird era. Any cars made in that range that aren't a Mustang may have the NPI or the PI motor. All of this information is specific to the 4.6, and the 5.4 was only an NPI motor for 1997 and 1998. The NPI was dropped entirely for the 5.4 liter V8 for 1999 and forward. The power ratings varied by application, but typically the NPI put out 190 horsepower to 210 in the 4.6 NPI. In 1997, the 5.4 was new, and it only had an NPI version for 1997 and 1998. It made 235 horsepower and was only used in the Ford F-150, the F-250, the F-350, the Econoline series E-150, 250, and 350, and then Lincoln's Navigator and Blackwood. The V10 was rated at 305 horsepower. The PI engines put out a little bit more horsepower, with the 4.6 being rated between 235 and 260 horsepower. The 5.4 2-valve PI motor made 260 horsepower in all naturally aspirated variants. Interestingly enough, the 5.4 2-valve was available in a supercharged variety in the Ford Lightning and some other vehicles. The maximum horsepower available from the factory was 380 horsepower for a 5.4 liter supercharged 2-valve motor. The 6.8 liter V10 made the same 305 horsepower until its revision into a 3-valve motor. The 4.6 has been found to be extremely efficient and suffers from no major common issues. Head gaskets, rotating assembly, timing components, the lower end and the upper end of the motor have proven to be extremely reliable and stout under extreme circumstances and normal usage. There are many examples available today of these motors available for sale, ready for service, in the taxi, limo, and police usage with well over 400,000 miles. No engine is without faults though. The 4.6 intake manifold is commonly made of plastic and has molded rubber rings around the coolant passages and intake passages that run through the intake manifold. The common issue here is coolant and vacuum leaks. Misfires, loss of coolant, engine overheating, and poor fuel economy are all symptoms of an intake manifold gasket leak. You can look for muddy gunk and dirt or water or wet spots around your spark plug holes to diagnose this. Or if you smell coolant from under your hood while the engine is hot, you probably have a coolant leak at the intake manifold gasket. The dormant intake from parts stores such as O'Reilly's, AutoZone, and Napa is a common failure point after roughly 2 or 3 years of usage, and people have seen them fail within 6 months to a year of usage. So it's worth buying the Ford OEM intake manifold, even though it is a little more expensive. Early 4.6 2-valve motors are known to have valve seal issues, and they can smoke while they're running. This is common on the early pre-1995-ish motors. All NPI motors have a risk of timing chain rattle. Now this is something that right as you start up and you don't have a lot of oil pressure, you'll hear a little rattling and then it'll go away, and it's usually not a big deal. If it gets bad enough, you can hear it while the car is running as well. This can cause performance and fuel economy issues, but most prompt is the annoyance of the sound. This repair is pretty expensive, so if you have the intent on keeping your car for a while and you either have a timing chain or a valve seal issue, it's worth doing both of those at the same time as a preemptive repair. All 2-valve motors are subject to using just a little more oil than we're used to. That's okay. All of these engines, they burn just a little bit of oil, and it's just part of the engineering of the motor itself. It's just something that's common, so if your car burns a quart or two per oil change, just keep it topped off. Another common issue for these motors is a coil pack failure. This is more for the 1996 and newer, as they have individual coil packs, 1 per cylinder, so 8 for a V8 or 10 for a V10. Make sure if you're replacing your coil packs, you use Ford OEM coil packs. Ford OEM coil pack is just simply the best one to use. The Ford OEM coil packs do cost a little more than the aftermarket ones, but it's worth paying the extra money. If you're at the junkyard though, it's worth grabbing an extra Ford coil pack and throwing it in your parts box. That way you've got one and you don't have to replace an entire set if one happens to fail. The aftermarket for these engines is a little bit limited, but thanks to its existence in the Mustang GT, there is a little bit out there that you can use, whether you have an F-150, Crown Victoria, or a Mustang itself. Now, the absolute best route to make horsepower with a modular motor is going to just be boost. And I know you don't like to hear that because it's the more expensive option, but any other way of making power with a modular motor is just gonna be kind of a waste of money, aside from the tip at the end of this video that I'm gonna give you for the ultimate naturally aspirated 2-valve modular option. The 4.6 and the 5.4, they both have pretty weak connecting rods, and that is the weakness for the Ford modular motor itself. The connecting rods in the 4.6 are good for about 450 wheel horsepower. The 5.4 is limited to roughly the same. They can be built, but it does cost a lot of money to build a motor, so 450 horsepower at the wheel is kind of your limit. Other than that, the 4.6 and the 5.4, as well as the V10, are all incredibly stout motors. The crank and the block themselves are effective and strong enough to handle roughly 1200 horsepower, at which point you probably should consider a 5.4. Anything over 600 horsepower, the 4.6 has proven in motorsport to just get a little unreliable, whereas the 5.4, being a larger displacement, doesn't necessarily have the same issue. It's also a much stronger block, so you have a little bit less of a risk of losing all of your investment anyways. The V10 has 2 more connecting rods, which actually means that each individual cylinder needs to maintain less pressure, meaning that the connecting rod issue is a little bit less pronounced. The connecting rod issue is not something that'll affect a daily driver or anything under the 400, 425 wheel horsepower mark. 450 is just the mark where you have to worry about blowing things up, and that's pretty expensive. Because of the nature of the V10 is extremely responsive to boost, and the V10 6.8 liter 2-valve is capable of over 600 horsepower at the wheel, but it's incredibly capable of making torque, which means that a 2-valve V10 will be capable of over 1,000 foot-pounds of torque in a boosted application with fairly low boost required to get to that point. I would consider the modular motor to be extremely boost friendly, although some people might kind of look down their nose at it, because what is 450 horsepower in 2023? I mean, you get that out of V6s nowadays, but the modular motor, if it's something you've got and you can boost it on a budget, you know, as long as you get good tuning in there, 450 wheel horsepower is still an absolute ton of power for the street. Now, naturally aspirated builds do exist, however, they're extremely expensive. You'll generally aim for cams, head, intake. Heads are pretty expensive. Now, the intake manifold doesn't have a lot of options. There are a few out there, but again, they're pretty expensive. You can factor about twice as expensive as a comparable motor, say an LS, Chevy 350, or small block Ford of a previous generation. Typical for any Ford, the exhaust manifolds are just a pretty limiting factor, but on the 4.6, the headers being a 90-degree engine, so you have a typical 60-degree engine like a small block Ford, LS, Chevy 350, Dodge Magnum. Those are all 60-degree motors, but the modular motor is a 90-degree motor, so it's dramatically wider. Because of all this, it's incredibly difficult to get headers that fit without any modification, and it's incredibly difficult to install those headers as well. A Fox Body 302, you can get headers on those in probably an afternoon. It would be a weekend project at the very least for an SN95 or New Edge Mustang, both of which are equipped with a 4.6. And of course the headers are going to be dramatically more expensive for that as well. The absolute best combination if you're afraid to harness the power of the Hong Kong Hurricane is going to be headers and then an NPI-PI hybrid. Now, the NPI-PI hybrid is a combination of a PI block rotating assembly, connecting rods and pistons, with the heads and intake and throttle body of a PI motor. Now, in the NPI motor, they use the pistons to make compression. And then the PI motor uses the heads to make compression. So if you combine those, you get a large amount of compression, and you can get that for insanely cheap. A blown 4.6 might be worth $150. If you go and buy a blown PI and then just put all the top end stuff right on that NPI. You end up with a 10.5-ish to 1 compression ratio, and with proper tuning on a factory ECU, you can make well over 300 horsepower with this combination. It does require the use of 91 or better fuel. E85, if possible, can also be a benefit for this if that's available in your area. The final thing that I want to mention, and this is not necessarily specific to the 4.6, the 5.4, or the whole modular motor series, is gearing. Now, anything you're going to do short of boost might help your horsepower, but realistically, 5 to 10 horsepower differences are just not going to be felt in the seat of the pants. If you take the axle apart, you can change the ring gear and the pinion, which changes the ratio. Commonly, a Crown Victoria or a Mustang will come with a 2.73 or a 3.03 or a 3.27 rear end ratio. Some Lincoln Town Cars came with as steep as a 3.31, or a Crown Victoria Police Interceptor would have had a 3.55 rear end with a limited slip. Now, if you can up the ratio on this to a 3.55, 3.73 or a 410, that will bring the RPMs of your motor up all the time and create a little bit of extra use of gasoline, but a little bit of extra application of power. This is simply multiplying horsepower that the engine makes at the rear axle, so you will see a small impact on fuel economy for this, but that's pretty normal for any performance modification. The common application of a gear ratio will be to upgrade to a 3.73 if you have a manual transmission in a Crown Victoria or Mustang, or a 4.10 rear axle ratio if you have an automatic. This has been everything that I know off the top of my head about the 4.6, the 5.4, and the V10 Triton motor, the whole modular 2-valve series of motors. If you like this, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps me make content like this more often. If you disagree with something I said in the video, comment below. And I'd love to hear in the comments about your NPI or PI hybrid. If you have a video of one, any exhaust clips or modifications that you've done to yours, go ahead and link those in the comments below. I'll see if I can get them added to the description or add them to a future video. Thanks for watching Team Rocket Garage, and have a great day.